Welcome back to the Ignatius Press podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Petiprin, joined today by George Weigel, who hardly needs any introduction to our audience, but nonetheless, I will offer this piece of information about him, that George Weigel is Distinguished Senior Fellow at Washington's Ethics and Public Policy Center, and in fact, he holds the William E. Simon Chair in Catholic Studies there. He is one of America's leading public intellectuals, and we are delighted to welcome him to the show today. How are you?
I'm fine, Andrew. It's kind of you to introduce me. Every time I hear that phrase, one of America's leading public intellectuals, and think about the state of our intellectual culture, I'm thinking it's like being the greatest shortstop in Mongolia. In any event, it's kind of you to say it.
Well, it's true. And, hopefully what will come through in our conversation today, and among those who read your newest book, which we're going to be discussing in all your books, is that intellectualism is nothing to be ashamed of. And in fact, it's something we need a bit more of. The book that I alluded to just seconds ago is called Pomp, Circumstance, and Unsolicited Advice, Commencement Addresses and University Lectures. And it's for the reason that I mentioned the intellectualism is embedded there in the title of your book. The book that we're discussing is a collection of talks, of addresses that you've given in academic settings. And so I thought maybe we'd get our conversation started today, just thinking about how you got started with your work, and what was it, now you go and you speak to students and you speak in academic settings, but when was it for you that you realized you wanted to pursue the life of the mind and to kind of pursue the intellectual life publicly?
My career, such as it is really something of an accident. I mean, my first job after graduate school was teaching in the theology at the seminary in Seattle, which closed 2 years after I got onto the faculty. I hope I wasn't the cause of that, but the seminary closed, and that is when I went into the think tank world and the journalism world, and later back into the academic world, although not with a formal academic position. I mean, I've always been interested in books and reading. I was the kind of nerdy kid who liked to read the World Book Encyclopedia. But the trajectory of my professional life has been almost completely accidental. Some people would say, I would like to say providential. But I do feel at home in the university world. For the past several years, I've been back formally teaching a couple of times a year at the Angelicum, the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome, with an international body of students, which I enjoy greatly. Every July for 30 plus years, I've taught and now lead a 3-week intense seminar on Catholic social thought in Krakow, in Poland. So I'm at home in the university world and in the world of ideas. And I'm very grateful that I've been given the opportunity to pursue that vocation for more than 4 decades now.
I wonder in your travels and in the years of experience that you've had speaking in academic contexts, what is your just sort of brief assessment of the state of the university in the West, and maybe more specifically, what do you think kind of the role of the Catholic university or Catholics in the academy may be able to kind of do in the years ahead?
I think anyone who's been paying any attention over the past year and a half or so knows that, particularly on so-called elite campuses, higher education in the United States is a red-hot mess at the moment, where university administrators cannot bring themselves to discipline calls for genocide against the Jewish people, where all kinds of cancel culture runs a riot without any serious attempt to get a grip on it, get to grips with it. On the other hand, one has to say that there are some Catholic initiatives precisely on those elite campuses that hopefully will make a difference over time. The Thomistic Institute, run by my friends here in Washington at the Dominican House of Studies, now brings high-octane Catholic content onto precisely some of the worst of elite campuses, worst in the sense of their intellectual silliness and political wokery. That's a good sign. And I think the renaissance of Catholic liberal arts education around the country in recent decades provides a model that these so-called elite schools could follow if they really wanted to reform themselves. There are lots of examples of this. The University of Dallas, Benedictine College, Thomas Aquinas College, Christendom College, Catholic University is making a concerted effort to recover both Catholic identity and classic liberal learning. There are half a dozen more I could mention. University of Mary in North Dakota, and on and on and on. And this actually makes sense because as I point out in the forward to this new book, the Catholic Church invented what we know as the university. The Catholic Church invented the university in the High Middle Ages, and it invented it as a place of free and robust discussion in which even the most noteworthy, distinguished scholars had to openly defend their thinking against all comers in a process that was known as questiones disputate, disputed question. St. Bonaventure, St. Thomas Aquinas, whomever, at the University of Paris in the 13th century would make an argument, and then everybody would have at them, and they would have to respond. That's the kind of open, civil, but robust conversation that universities ought to foster, rather than being little sandboxes where adolescents and young adults are allowed to play revolutionary without really learning anything in the process.
Yeah, I think there's so much there, and I wonder if the right way to continue would be to transition to talking a little bit about Pope St. John Paul II, who was a great scholar, a man of university life, very much so, and also obviously a great saint and churchman. And you're the one to talk to about that, since obviously you're the author of Witness to Hope, the great English language biography of John Paul II. And I know that when you went to these campuses and you gave talks and you gave commencement addresses, the talks and the addresses that are included here in this new collection, you very often spoke about John Paul II for obvious reasons. I wonder now, to kind of get into talking about him a little bit, if 20 years after his death, I just wonder personally, what does his enduring legacy mean to you, and what does he mean to those you go and talk to when you conjure his name? What is the reaction now, maybe compared to how it was 20 years ago or 10 years ago?
Let's begin with the idea of Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, as a university man. I think that's of some interest. One of his colleagues at the Catholic University of Lublin, where Wojtyła taught in the philosophy department for many years, described Lublin to me in 1997, I believe, as the only place where philosophy was free between Berlin and Vladivostok. I mean, you had this 13 time zone area where intellectual life was completely corrupted by communism. And yet there was this little island of free inquiry. in Eastern Poland called the Catholic University of Lublin. So Wojtyła, I think, very early came to understand how islands of genuine freedom could have ripple effects throughout entire societies. When I speak about John Paul II to university students today, I'm speaking about someone they did not know. As you mentioned, Pope died 20 years ago this month. These kids generally have absolutely no living memory of him. Many of them have encountered him through the theology of the body, which is no bad way to encounter him. But there's so much more there to be explored. What does he still mean 20 years after his holy death? I think he made Christianity exciting again. He made Christian living an adventure again. When John Paul II was elected in October 1978, the Catholic Church was in a somewhat decrepit condition. There had been almost 15 years of a kind of theological and ecclesiastical civil war within the church about the meaning of the Second Vatican Council. People were exhausted. People were depressed. It seemed that the church had nothing to say to the sexual revolution, for example. And then here comes this Polish intellectual, sportsman, poet, who at his inaugural mass in St. Peter's Square on October 22nd, 1978, says, "Be not afraid, open the doors to Christ," and repeats that several times. There was a great story written about that event by a French journalist, a man named André Frossard, who put in the lead of his report to the Paris newspaper he was writing for, having seen and heard that clarion call to Christian adventure, if you will. This is not a pope from Poland. This is a pope from Galilee. Wonderful line. I mean, just a wonderful line. And I think that captures the essence of John Paul II. It's the kind of apostolic excitement that the church will read about in a couple of weeks when, after Easter, we read the Acts of the Apostles at Mass every day until the solemnity of Pentecost. So that's what he did. That's who he was. And he did that even in his old age and even in his sickness. He kept saying, look at Christ and you will find the way to truly human living, to beatitude, and you'll never be bored. And that's the message I've tried to convey in these commencement addresses that are collected in Pomp, Circumstance, and Unsolicited Advice.
Yeah. In several of the talks, you mentioned the 9 days in June of 1979. And, it just occurs to me that, you mentioned how the Catholic Church was kind of moribund in certain ways at the time of Karol Wojtyła's election with regard to kind of disputes among itself after the Second Vatican Council. But the world, it seemed to me at that time, had also just about made its peace with, like, just sort of threw its hands up to say, oh, well, communism's always going to be around. We'll just have to deal with it or something. And that wasn't the case. John Paul II became one of these great figures who helped defeat it, at least, as it was then. So I wonder if you could just say a little more about the significance of those 9 days and what they mean.
Well, you're exactly right, Andrew, in that the world had written off the church as an engine of change in history. In fact, my favorite endnote in the 100 pages of endnotes in Witness to Hope is when I quote a completely idiotic New York Times editorial 3 days into the Pope's visit to Poland in June 1979, in which, harumphing as they do, the Times editors said, however encouraging the Pope's visit may be to his fellow Catholics, it will make no difference to the political circumstances of Central and Eastern Europe. Well, 10 years later, the wall is down and communism is gone, and the Times editors are looking like bloody fools here. What did he do? He ignited, I think is the better word, a revolution of conscience that made possible a different kind of politics, the politics expressed by the Solidarity movement, which began as a trade union and became a great social movement for civic reform and ultimately political reform. And he did that by, over those 9 days, June 2nd to June 10th, 1979, giving back to the people of Poland the truth about themselves, who they were as a nation, who they were as a culture, saying in dozens of variations on one great theme, you are not who they, the communist authorities, say you are. Permit me to remind you who you are. You are a people formed by a distinctive history at the center of which, actually at the beginning of which, is your Catholic faith. And if you own that and all that that means, you will eventually find tools of resistance that the people who have the monopoly on material force cannot match, because the tools of resistance will be cultural and spiritual. And that's, of course, exactly what happened and unfolded over the next 10 years, which were difficult, to be sure, but were ultimately successful. This was a great lesson in leadership. It was also a great lesson, I think, in how history actually works. I mean, for the previous 250 years, 200 years, it was thought since the French Revolution that politics, understood as my capacity to impose my will on you, was the driver of history. Then came the Marxist heresy that economic forces, impersonal economic forces, are the driver of history, and we're simply the exhaust fumes of that. John Paul II's revolution of conscience falsified both of those ideas of how history works. Culture is the driver of history over the long haul, and at the center of culture is cult, what people worship, what people believe in, what people are willing to stake their lives on. And that remains as true today, 40 plus years after that, those great events in Poland, as it did then.
This is a good segue to talking about culture. And in one of the addresses that you gave, I believe this is one of the ones, a very recent one, actually, I think, that you gave in Rome, you talk about the idea of being culture warriors. And you mentioned how there's this tendency now for, well, I'll just read you what you wrote. You said, culture warrior has become a term of shunning, even disparagement in certain Catholic circles. But this is not right. And you conclude by saying the culture war was declared on us. I thought this was really terrific, what you wrote about this. I wonder if you could say more about this and maybe help us understand how it is we should be fighting this culture war.
At the center of what is often referred to as the culture war are two contesting ideas of freedom. Is freedom summed up in Frank Sinatra's antiphon, I did it my way, freedom as sheer willfulness? Or is there more to freedom than that? Is freedom a matter of choosing the right thing, which we can know by both reason and revelation, for the right reason and doing so over time as a matter of moral habit or virtue. The Sinatra idea of freedom, the I did it my way idea of freedom, is frankly infantile. It's what a 2-year-old thinks of freedom as. I want this, I want it now, and I'm going to raise Cain until I get it. The nobler kind of freedom, the freedom that attaches itself to the truth, the freedom that aims at goodness, is a much more adult concept of freedom. Now, you can pretty well parse the culture war on everything from sexual morality to the life of universities and all points in between by where do you come down on that question? Is freedom willfulness, or is freedom tethered to truth and ordered to goodness? This is true all over the Western world. That's the great divide. How do we contest all this? There are certainly arguments to be made, and I hope to make some of them in the book. But we also contest it, and perhaps primarily contest it, by living lives of nobility and decency and being willing to engage arguments rather than blowing off adversaries with snark or tweets or whatever. We have to demonstrate that what Father Serve Pincair's called freedom for excellence makes for nobler lives. In fact, makes for happiness, and ultimately leads, in the Catholic view, to beatitude, whereas freedom as sheer willfulness eventually becomes very lonely, very difficult to form and sustain friendships of any sort, including that distinctive form of friendship called marriage, when freedom is sheer willfulness. Now, we've been fighting this in the United States for years. And the contest continues. And the effort, now primarily a cultural effort, to impose freedom as willfulness on everybody, has to be fought. Now, we didn't create this contest. As I say, the war was declared on us. And, if there are certain churchmen who, are antsy about fighting this, they need to read the Acts of the Apostles again. The church has always been a counterculture, but it's not a counterculture to be different just for the sake of being different, the way the 60s counterculture was. The Catholic counterculture is a positive counterculture aimed at reforming, deepening the best in any culture in which it finds itself. So to be a culture reforming counterculture is different than just being a hell-raising counterculture of the sort I remember from my adolescence and young adulthood. So that's what I would say to those who are nervous about being called culture warriors. If I could vary Leon Trotsky for Catholic purposes, you may not be interested in the culture war, but the culture war is interested in you.
Yeah.
And you can't avoid it.
Yeah. Yeah. Sticking with culture, I wonder if we could talk about Europe for a few minutes, because a number of the talks, quite a few of them in the book here, are ones that you've delivered in Europe. You mentioned at the outset that you're in Rome a lot, you're in Poland a lot. Obviously, John Paul II and Benedict XVI were European men, and they lived through the 20th century and the enormous sea changes that happened on the European continent during those decades. You talk a bit in different talks in the book about Centesimus Annus, the encyclical by John Paul II, and you also talk about Ecclesia in Europa, which was an apostolic exhortation he gave very late in his life. Um, you know, I guess what I want to ask you about is just, is Europe lost, or is there still a place to look there as kind of the, in a sense, like the basis of Christian culture in many places in the world?
Well, it better not be lost, Andrew, because if it's lost, it may take us down with it, because these are our civilizational roots. Uh, uh, America is Europe transplanted. Now, we might want to think it's been improved in the process, uh, in everything from pizza to cricket becoming baseball. These are improvements, and we like to think of that as that. But if the Western civilizational project that was born in Europe from a, I think, providential meeting, if you will, of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome, biblical religion, Greek reason, Roman law, if that project fails, then what are the alternative projects? Well, there's the Xi Jinping project. That's not a terribly attractive prospect. There's the Ayatollah Khamenei project. That's not particularly attractive at the moment. So we have to not only hope, we have to work for the renewal of the Western civilizational project on both sides of the Atlantic. That's a bit harder in certain parts of Europe, particularly Western Europe, because the church there remains in a kind of funk, has not taken on what John Paul II called the new evangelization, has not understood that the church has to be a missionary enterprise, not just a social service agency. In the parts of Europe where the new evangelization is understood and embraced and lived, I think, there are some real signs of hope. I'm right after Easter. I'm going to spend a week in Norway with Bishop Eric Varden in the apostolic territorial prelature of Trondheim. Well, one does not think of Norway as a dynamo of the new evangelization, and yet it is. There's all sorts of interesting things going on there. I'm going to help Bishop Varden launch a 5-year new evangelization project leading up to the millennium celebration of Christian history in Norway. In this past December, I met Cardinal Anders Arborelius of Stockholm in Rome, and he was telling me about the growth of the church in Sweden. Now, there's still a lively Catholicism in parts of Central and Eastern Europe. It's Germany that's the real problem. And I don't really know what's to be done about that, because the leadership of the German church, with maybe a half a dozen exceptions among the bishops, is still committed to the failed project that I have been calling for years, decades now, Catholic Light. And Catholic Light is really of no interest to anybody, or what I'm now calling the Church of Perhaps, or the Church of Maybe, is not going to be something to attract people to the possibility of friendship with the incarnate Son of God. So the church has a major role to play in the renewal of the Western civilizational project, but it only can do that if it really is the church of Jesus Christ.
You bring up several times the great French thinker Remy Brague, who I think insightfully identified the 21st century as the century of being and nothingness. And I'm just wondering if what you're saying about kind of renewal efforts in Scandinavia and all these kinds of places are people waking up and realizing they want reality, they don't want nothingness. Does that seem accurate?
I think that's right. I mean, it's a bit complicated in Scandinavia because a lot of this growth is from immigration, from Middle East, from other parts of the world, from Ukraine. I mean, the joke about the church in Norway used to be that it was a ship with a German captain, a Polish crew, and Vietnamese passengers, meaning the faithful were all Vietnamese, the clergy were all Polish, and the bishop was German. Some of the ethnicities have changed, but there's still some truth to that. But it's not the whole picture anymore. And yes, I think, nihilism gets boring after a while. And if you look at the crisis of mental health around the Western world, is telling some people, including those suffering from severe mental health problems, that, yeah, if nihilism, to borrow from Patty Page, is all there is, that's not something on which you could stake a life or build a marriage and a family, or look into the future with some hope. So maybe we're seeing a bottoming out of that. And yes, Remy Brague, who is one of the 5 smartest people in the world and 10 funniest people in the world, is exactly right that now we're having gone through the century of true and false and the century of good and evil, 19th century, 20th century, we're now in being or nothing. Either we attend to the deep truths built into the world and into us, or denying that such truths exist, civilization collapses. So those seem to be the choices right now.
Yeah. A moment ago, I mentioned Centesimus Annus, the encyclical by John Paul II, which marked the 100th anniversary of Pope Leo XIII's great encyclical Rerum Novarum. You often refer to kind of the legacy of Leo XIII and kind of where we are with regard to Catholic social teaching. I wonder if you could say something about that, maybe in light of kind of our current political realities in the West. Where are we, as Catholics and sort of in the wider world as we kind of think about these things?
Well, we're not where we should be, I don't think. It may be that the classic period of Catholic social doctrine ran from Rerum Novarum to Centesimus Annus. That's a full century. And now we're off on a slightly different trajectory. From Rerum Novarum to Centesimus Annus, Catholic social doctrine was an edifice built on a kind of leonine scaffolding, if you will. There was an intellectual architecture within which the social doctrine evolved and developed. There's not been a whole lot of development within that architecture, within that scaffolding, since 1991. I mean, popes have said interesting things, but they've tended to be more ad hoc. What's so impressive about Catholic social doctrine in its classical form is that it's a comprehensive view of modernity and how to live nobly and in social solidarity within modernity, addressing culture, society, economics, politics, international relations. It's all part of one comprehensive package. And that was its power, I think. And that's what allowed John Paul II in bringing that tradition to a very fine point of development in Centesimus Annus to lay out a vision of the free and virtuous society of the 21st century as consisting of a democratic polity, a free economy, and a vibrant public moral culture, the last being the most important because that vibrant public moral culture disciplines and directs the politics and the economics, that really still has a lot of power, it seems to me, today. The church does best when it, in addressing the public sphere, when it offers a vision of human possibility and social possibility. We do less well when we start to, be one more advocate of this, that, or the other particular public policy or cause.
Yeah. Well, maybe continuing on from that, I wanted to be sure we spent time talking about the last couple of addresses that you included in the volume that have to do with kind of the international order and have to do with kind of, the world today, not just the West, but kind of the wider world. And, one of the talks it's a very significant piece of writing, piece of speaking. I hope everybody really spends time with it when they get the book, where it goes all, it's back from 2002, I believe, where you're reflecting on kind of the post 9/11 world order. Now we're a long way away, it suddenly seems, from 9/11. And a lot of people are rethinking some of the assumptions that we sort of carried out of 9/11. And, so I guess, you were and are a leading voice from the Catholic world, speaking into some of these questions about just war and about kind of, the use of American might as a kind of, how we use soft power, all these kinds of things. And I just wonder, I'll just kind of send it back to you in an open-ended way. What are your thoughts on this in the year 2025, these decades removed from that time?
Well, interestingly enough, that lecture that you referred to, which was at the Catholic University of America Law School, was the annual John the 23rd lecture. John 23rd, of course, is remembered for the encyclical Pacem in Terris of 1963, Peace on Earth. And there was for centuries something recognizable called Catholic international relations theory. It was not just the just war tradition. It was a just war way of thinking embedded in a larger view of international relations and international law. And that tradition, that Catholic international relations theory tradition, seems to me to have lain pretty fallow for the last several decades. Some of the problems within the just war tradition I discuss in that essay, but the larger problem comes when significant authorities in the church say, for example, there is no such thing as a just war. Well, try making that argument in Ukraine today. That doesn't make any sense. If you're trying to say, look, after 5,000 years of human civilization, we should have figured out a better way to resolve political conflict and mass violence. Yeah, that's right. But since we haven't, and since some people are manifestly uninterested in doing so, what do you do then? What do you do then? The point I would make about the just war way of thinking, is that it's not a set of hoops that ethicists set out for political leaders and statesmen to jump through. And if you successfully jump through the hoops, then okay, have at it. That's simply a cartoon view of the tradition. The tradition, rightly understood, is a theory of statecraft which tries to set out a framework of moral reflection in which public officials who have a moral responsibility for the common good can think through some very difficult issues with religious leaders, with ethicists, with moral theologians, etc. But it's not a tradition that produces cut and dried answers the way Dunkin' Donuts produces honey dipped donuts. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. But it is a useful framework for reflection and remains so today, particularly at a time when too many Americans, I'm afraid, are getting exhausted by the responsibilities of leadership in the world. That's just not acceptable, I'm afraid. The world is going to be ordered in some fashion, and who leads the ordering, the sorting out of things, makes a great difference. I do not want Xi Jinping defining the world order of the 21st century. I don't want any of the other little autocrats or big autocrats running small countries and large countries defining the world political future. If Americans do not gather themselves to support a robust United States presence in the world, which will work through many forms of power, including soft power, not simply military, feeding the hungry. President George W. Bush's AIDS initiative in Africa, the way we as a country have traditionally helped women live with the basic necessities of life in the third world. This has all made friends for us, and it's part of shaping a better human future. So to abandon all of that is not only cruel, but it's going to make for a lot of trouble down the line.
Does it seem to you, I get the idea that, Americans got, it was very well put what you said before, I thought, about how we're almost exhausted as Americans we just don't want to keep going for some reason. We just kind of, and maybe it's because we had leaders for a couple of decades who went around the world basically just saying we were just any other country, and we're not just any other country. But I just wonder, do you feel that there's kind of too much of an emphasis now on kind of isolationism or withdrawal, or do you think that's a problem?
Yeah,
no,
I do. I do. I mean, you can't make America great by making America alone. That's just silly.
Yeah.
The world simply does not work that way anymore. What does bother me is what I call a kind of shortened attention span here. I mean, take the war in Ukraine, for example. I mean, I was hearing a year ago, 2 years into this, well, we don't know how this is going to end, so let's just get out of there. Well, I'm sorry, if you know any history, 2 years into the Second World War, the United States had no idea how it was going to end or when it was going to end. I mean, this demand for instant satisfaction, instant gratification, is the result of our living in an entertainment culture that has been made even more myopic by the enormous influence of social media, which is social media is to serious argument like my 2-year-old wonderful grandson banging on a keyboard is to the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. This is just, these are two different realities. And the Twitter world or X world or whatever it is not a place of serious discussion. And yet it now has an enormous influence right here in Washington and Congress. These guys and gals are terrified of Twitter storms attacking. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sorry, that's not appropriate.
Yeah.
That's just not appropriate.
Yeah. Um, I wonder if we could spend our remaining time maybe jumping back into church stuff and jumping back in time a little bit, because I really wanted to spend a little time talking about what was my favorite reflection that you offered in the book, which was your talk about John Henry Newman. I myself am a former Anglican. John Henry Newman is very dear to me. I'm devoted to him. And I, I, I love the way that you talked about his life and connecting it to the idea of the development of doctrine, that his life developed, as it were, into his full participation in the Catholic Church. I wonder if you could just talk about John Henry Newman and what he means to you and what you were saying there.
Well, we were talking a moment ago, Andrew, about John Paul II and making Christianity an adventure again. Well, while John Henry Newman was not an adventurer like the great 19th century explorers were, he didn't go to the North Pole or the South Pole or the jungles of Africa or whatever. He was an intellectual adventurer, but one who was, from his adolescent radical conversion, when he became the evangelical John, uh, focused like a laser beam on the person of Jesus Christ and what that means for the church and for the world. And as that evolved through his Anglican Reform phase into his Catholic phase, the adventure remained one that was Christocentric. And that's a great model for everyone. I think Newman was the first, certainly in the Anglosphere, to demonstrate how the great enduring truths of Christian faith could be presented in a way that modern minds could hear. Newman became a Catholic at a time when a lot of the Catholic world thought, the catechism answers were sufficient. You memorize the catechism, you've got the answer to everything. Those formulas are, cut in marble, and you can't really get any other formulas to express those truths of faith. And Newman showed a path beyond all of that. And yet he did it with a profound respect for the tradition of the church over time. In that lecture on Newman at the Angelicum in Rome, which I think was the day before his canonization, I spoke about being at Newman's oratory at Birmingham, where his library, which is this big 2-story horseshoe, is still in place, and just how completely moving it was to pull this big folio volume off the shelf of the Opera Omnia of Gregory the Great, Pope St. Gregory the Great, and see on the flyleaf the inscription, "To my dear friend J.H. Newman, E. Pusey." These are 19th century men who are living the ecumenism of time across, in that case, 13 centuries, and doing so, as I say, with this laser focus on Christ and what Christ means for the world. Newman's was not an easy life, but it was a life of constant, I think, adventure. And in the sense that Newman helped the church really understand what the difference is between true development of Catholic self-understanding and false claims to development, remains immensely important today. Newman understood that the church does not do paradigm shifts. The church does development, But if you say the church does paradigm shifts, then you either don't understand the church or you don't understand what a paradigm shift is. Paradigm shift is going from Ptolemy's view of the geocentric universe to the Copernican view. That's not a development. That's a whole new thing.
Yeah.
And that is not what the Catholic Church does.
Yeah.
So the chatter in the past decade or so about, Vatican II was a paradigm shift would stand Newman's hair on end. Yeah. Would also stand John the 23rd's hair on end if he had any hair.
Do you think,
that was not what he thought of the council.
And yet, so this language of paradigm shift and this way of thinking in terms of paradigm shift is still very much with us. But I also think appreciation for John Henry Newman is growing. So I guess I'm hoping that kind of more and more people will gravitate towards precisely the point you're trying to make and leave behind this paradigm shift thinking. Do you think that may happen?
Well, it's going to happen. It has to happen because we look at the living parts of the world church today, whether we're talking about the living parts of the church in the United States or throughout the world church. And it's those parts of the church that have embraced Catholicism in full, like Newman. And the dying parts of the church are those that continue to try to make the failed project of Catholic light work. It doesn't work. Catholic light leads to Catholic zero. Pardon me, Coca-Cola. But it does. And, the poor, the disastrous situation, the very sad situation of the church in Germany is the most telling case of that. Whereas in sub-Saharan Africa, where all-in Catholicism is being preached, you have this fantastic growth such that will be the demographic center of the world church well before the end of this century.
Yeah. Let's go out on this. In the wake of the Second Vatican Council, the emphasis was very much on the idea that the faith had to be proposed. But it seemed that a lot of people didn't really take that seriously because there was still enough kind of cultural Catholicism there was enough kind of inertia. There was enough, institutional, apparatus that sort of got put aside. But, as you go around talking to students and giving these addresses, you're there in a sense to propose. And, I wonder if people are finally starting to get this. And if the message of the faith must be proposed, and when it's proposed, it's pretty compelling. I wonder if that's finally starting to hit the mark.
Well, I think to go back to what I just said a moment ago, that's the explanation for why the living parts of the world church are alive. Mm-hmm. And the failure to propose, either because you don't really believe it, in the church of perhaps, or because you still think that, look, if you're a Mexican, you're going to be a Catholic. If you're a Pole, you're going to be a Catholic. If you're a Lithuanian, you're going to be a Catholic. If you live in Bavaria, you're going to be a Catholic. That is over. Mm-hmm. That's done. The ethnic transmission belt, or what I call DNA Catholicism, is over. It just can't make it. It can't survive in the postmodern cultural circumstance in which we find ourselves. The people who have figured that out and are proposing the gospel and friendship with Christ as the revelation of the true meaning of human life and its ultimate destiny, those are the parts of the world church that are growing. And it's the DNA places that tend to be dying.
Yeah. Well, we certainly need more faithful pastors to do this work of proposing, but we also need more lay people, lay public intellectuals like you, George, to do this work. And you do it in your new book, Pomp, Circumstance, and Unsolicited Advice, Commencement Addresses and University Lectures, new out from Ignatius Press. George Weigel, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you, Andrew. Good to be with you.